They say you've won thousands. One of your friends is backstage. He said you've lost 250,000, maybe to him.
I mean, in a game, yeah.
Yeah, okay. It's really quiet and feels a little dead in here. Has everybody been in here a while? Maybe just everybody stand up. Come on, you can do it. Stand up, stretch it out a little bit. Turn it up. I mean, we have the opportunity to break some new ground up here. So open your minds up. Let's dig in. Chamath, we're going to start. This is my 20th year here.
This is my first.
20 years ago, there were about 8 of us, and the question was, will anybody ever book travel on the intrawebs? This is really interesting. Tonight, I want to cover real quickly your views on internet and technology landscape. Of course, we're going to explore Virgin Galactic, and then peer around the corner and think about the stuff that we get most excited about.
Yep.
But just to level set, let's start with a quick lightning round about who you are, what you've done. You grew up in Sri Lanka and Canada.
Yep.
Rich or poor?
Well, my parents were kind of ruling class in Sri Lanka. And then in the Civil War, we emigrated to Canada, and I grew up on welfare.
Siblings?
2 younger sisters.
Favorite sport?
Basketball.
You moved to Silicon Valley in 1999. Why?
I had a job as a derivatives trader. I was an electrical engineering grad, but I had a job as a derivatives trader. I had a, kind of come to Jesus moment where I didn't really feel like I was being very productive. And the smartest kids in my class had gone there. I went to school in Canada, University of Waterloo. So I just followed them.
You joined AOL, or was there a step? There's something before AOL.
Yeah, there was a company called Winamp, which I was a part of, which was acquired by AOL. It made a media player. It was kind of, before iTunes was iTunes, there was this thing called Winamp, and it was 8 of us. And then I became part of AOL Music, and then I ran AOL Instant Messenger, and then I left and I joined Facebook. And
joined Facebook in 07.
Yeah, it was one of the founding kind of senior 4 or 5
What were your first impressions meeting Zuckerberg?
I met him in 2005 when I was at AOL. This guy, Sean Parker, who was the president of Facebook at the time, brought him to my office in Washington, D.C., because he was in D.C. at the time visiting his parents, and he had brought Zuck with him. And kind of like very similar to the movie, he showed up in flip-flops and like a fleece vest in the middle of November, and I thought, he's either absolutely fucking crazy or, he's a genius and he knows something I don't know. It turned out to be the latter, so I went to work for him.
So you left Facebook to start your own VC firm, Social Capital, in 2011?
Yeah. Kind of when everybody was running to get in the doors, I could not wait to get out.
You got lucky and invested in the Golden State Warriors?
Was very lucky to be a part of that. That was really good.
You're a dad of 4?
4 kids.
Favorite activity with the kids?
Honestly, doing nothing.
Now, let's jump in. Google. There are 2 big stocks in the internet travel industry that blew up over the course of the last couple of weeks, TripAdvisor and Expedia. They both pointed fingers at Google. Expedia stock has underperformed Google by 140% over the last 5 years. TripAdvisor worse, at underperforming by 200%. You and I have been talking about Google turning free search into paid search for years. Rob Torres from Google's in the crowd. He's literally like pouring cocktails into people in the crowd while he turns the heat up on the pot. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on at Google and the implications for not only those in the e-commerce travel ecosystem, but the internet ecosystem more broadly.
Yeah, it's important to take a step back and realize what's happening, which is that Google is a monopoly. I don't care what the regulatory reaction to that word is or what the legal department of Google thinks, but it is a monopoly. And I think that that's a fabulous thing. Great businesses are monopolies. They have pricing power. They have basically meaningful network effects. They control customers. They have massive gross margins. They have huge profitability that's repeatable and predictable. In all those dimensions, Google is a monopoly. Now you have to take a step back, though, and figure out what their problem is. Well, They struck gold, and they literally said the business strategy for the first 20 years of the company is to hire every able-bodied man and woman, anywhere they can find them, to run outside with a bucket while money falls from the sky. And then to run back inside as fast as possible so that somebody else can count it while they run back outside while the money falls from the sky. That's the quality of that business. But the problem is that people, specifically in the equity markets and the public markets, need to figure out, as that 20-year window closes, what is the next act? You know, it's like Kanye West can drop a great album, but he's just a one-hit wonder unless he keeps dropping successive albums. You know, Apple is a great company in the first 20 years of the iPhone, but eventually they have to transition their business. Google, similarly, is now in a position where they know that the clock is running out on their second act, meaning investor patience will wane. And you can see it in how they've run the company. So the first thing they do is they reorganize themselves so that they can separate the core search business, which is effectively Google, from everything else, so that investors can just say, hey, okay, take a break, we're figuring this out. Then the second thing they do is they basically try to buy themselves enough time, which is, as you say, they turn up the heat slowly on the core search business to increase profitability while they take that money and throw millions of darts at a dartboard, hoping to find this next great second act. And so if you are a business who thrives inside this Google environment, the longer it takes for them to find a second act, the more you're fucked. End of story. And so what will happen is that their gross margins will continue to be stable, their EBITDA margins will continue to be stable, and ratably, tick for tick, every single person that feeds off of them will see their gross margin erode, will see their profitability erode, because they will make sure that they boil the frog slowly enough so that they can at least keep a lid on an investor revolt against them at the sake of people in the ecosystem. So that's the unvarnished truth of what's happening. All of that said, I love the company and I love the stock as an investor. If I was living in the ecosystem, your business strategy has to be fundamentally different. And what do I mean by that? If you are in the business of being a parasite on top of Google, your medium-term and long-term prospects are terrible. You're an impaired company. You don't know it. If you haven't figured out how to be unique, you're in a really tough situation. If you're a unique company that's increasingly become more competitive and similar to everybody else, you're running towards the Google buzzsaw versus away from it. And so, travel is really interesting because it is one of the few canaries in the coal mine about what their true long-term business goals and strategy and real issues are. And you see it play out with, TripAdvisor and Expedia. Some part of it is misexecution, as we talked about, some part of it, but it can be a bunch of things. But at the core of it is a decision that they will capture the overwhelming majority of profit in the travel sector.
And one of the interesting things on that is there's been a lot of talk over the years whether or not further consolidation could occur in the travel industry. With the thinking that Booking.com is the $100 billion player in the industry and they couldn't possibly further consolidate. But the reality is that the largest player in the online travel industry is Google.
It's Google by far.
They extract over 10, if they had segment reporting on Google Travel, I think Google Travel does over $10 billion in EBITDA, more than every other online travel company on the planet combined.
Yeah.
And, but yet they've managed to kind of fly onto that radar. It is interesting that notwithstanding the fact that TripAdvisor, who is one of the biggest free riders in Google, free search, is now the one who's lost the most equity value, as Google harvests free search into paid search. But if you look at Booking.com, they were always a taxpayer, right? They were the biggest advertiser within Google, but they paid Google.
Look, the history repeats itself, or at least it rhymes. And so if you go back to the 1500s and you look at sort of, modern feudalism in the 1500s, the farmer that pays the tax is generally okay in up and down cycles. It's the folks that don't pay the tax that all of a sudden has to pay the tax when, the prince or your overlord ruler says, hey, listen, I need more wheat from you. He or she is the one that's really upset.
Right. You talk in your annual letter about the advantages of the large platforms. So the large global platforms, Baba, Amazon, Facebook, Google, they're growing 2 to 3 times as fast as mid-sized internet companies. They're already 5 to 20 times larger. They're 4 to 5 times more profitable, and they're spending 100 times more on R&D. So if you look at Google and Apple, Amazon, they each spend 15 to 20 billion on R&D. Any one of those companies spends more than the next 50 internet companies combined. What does this mean for the advantages or disadvantages as we look at the next wave of computing? And I'm thinking about the words you shared in your annual letter.
You know, there's a handful of us that have this belief that, you know, innovation has stopped even many years before Facebook, Google, and Amazon. It's just that they make it easier to see in broad daylight. You know, we've gone from a world where we used to have incredibly ambitious objectives that both reasonable and unreasonable people would consider valuable and then would support. You know, the Apollo project is a good example. You know, Manhattan Project is another example. And since then, we've been in actually like a 50-year sort of cycle of secular decay in terms of the technological vibrancy we've seen. They just allow us to see it more manifestly in front of our eyes. So we live in a world right now where in the absence of something exogenous that stops those companies from essentially continuing their dominance, then the amount of innovation we see will continue to monotonically decay until people are even more frustrated and feel even more sort of left out than they are.
Is that because they don't, but you know, you've talked about Bezos being an incredible allocator of capital. Don't some of these problems, you know, associated with machine learning, AI, require this scale? And yet you seem to be making the argument that they don't innovate at scale.
Well, they don't. Look, again, like just macro speaking, how many of you in the audience have built a house in the last 10 years? Built a house. And if I asked you on average, I would say the average amount of time it took you to build a house was probably 2 to 3 years. And if it was more grandiose, it would be even more. It took us 18 months to build the Empire State Building. And now you can't build a single-family home in less than 2 or 3 years. It took us 3 or 4 years to build the Golden Gate Bridge. Now you try to put a throughway in between, you know, 2 neighborhoods, it takes 5 years. So we, as a whole societal species, have had this tendency to introduce inefficiency as technical innovation has gone down. So what big companies do is they absorb that inefficiency and promulgate it into the world. Why is it that in the last 30 or 40 years, the biggest advent in semiconductors and chips really has been Intel? Why is it that we still run on general purpose compute? You know, all the great fangled ideas that we may have about AI and this and that, and yet we still haven't invented a compute fabric that can compete with Intel or NVIDIA. And these are all poor men's solutions that are a byproduct of just corporate bureaucracy and excess cash. So,
I'm going to interrupt. Keep going.
No, so my point is, it's not that we're past some point of salvation.
Right.
It's not that. I'm actually deeply optimistic about what can happen in the future. But in order to do it, the pendulum, which has swung, in my opinion, far too far to the extreme of this unproductive form of hypercapitalism, now needs to swing in the other direction. Hypercapitalism is embodied when there's a complete divorcing between the company's shareholders and the company's stakeholders. The shareholders are a bunch of nameless, faceless hedge funds who basically demand that you take as much money as possible, you buy back stock, or you do nothing with it. Stakeholders would say, invest it, put it into your people. Every time, you know, you and I had this conversation flying out here, it confounds me whenever I see great companies say, you know what, we are fabulous, we love our people, and then they pay at the 50th percent of a salary band. First of all, why do these salary surveys exist? And second of all, why would any great company not just say, I'm great, I pay at the 100% of the band? I pay at the 100% of the band. And then I expect 100% of the performance. So we go through all of these machinations that instead just allow us to bloat and bloat and bloat and bloat. Yet, when the things that are required to be done, the capital doesn't exist because it's already been misallocated. So if you create a mechanism where capitalism can come back, where you can merge the shareholder and the stakeholder, where employees and individuals are more incentivized to be actually truly innovative and create, you start to right the ship. And what's going to happen is a bunch of turbulent manifestations of frustration, aka populism, that then eventually calm itself down and it'll factor itself into policy. This is why these big companies will get regulated. They will absolutely get broken up. This is not 1999 Microsoft DOJ. This is basically the turn of the century Gilded Age, or this is, it's that kind of schism that we are probably embarking on. I don't really have a personal view of what's better or worse, except I think change is generally good. And if you look at the last 40 to 50 years, anything that starts to reverse this trend is really productive for the world.
Hit pause on that. I'll only defer because it's Philip. Philip has a question.
2 questions, actually.
Nope, just one.
First one is, what number conference is this for you, Brad?
Number 20.
20. Anybody been here more than 20? That's pretty good. Okay, Chamath, which companies are going to get broken up and when?
I think that when you look at the really large, big tech ones, Facebook, Google, Amazon, maybe Microsoft, not really, maybe Apple, but in order of probability, Facebook first, then Google, then I think all the other ones are a little bit more delayed. It's going to be those, and it's probably in the next, sort of like 5 to 10 year time frame. Facebook is the most obvious one just because they touch many politicians where they live, eat, breathe, and get paid. Google will be next just because I think that it winning has not proved to be successful. If you were able to capture your ecosystem's margin and then solve cancer, people would say, capture more margin. But if all you're doing is buying pistachios for your engineers and, just fucking around with all kinds of nonsense, it's not productive capitalism. So fuck the pistachios, stop it, and allow the 1,000 flowers to bloom, so to speak. It's better for the world that happens. No, I mean, I love pistachios, by the way. Don't get me wrong.
Facebook. You work there, you help build it, you're friends with Cheryl and Mark. It's one of our largest investments at Altimeter. Stock's up 300% over the last 5 years, twice the performance of Google. It only trades at 10 times EBITDA. It's growing at 30%. But pretend I'm Cheryl for a second. Why are you busting my ass?
No, I'm not. I'm just sort of an objective.
Why are you such a critic of what we're doing?
No, I'm not. I actually think that what they serve is really powerful in the following very basic, simple idea. Facebook is it's better that you go on Facebook and fight there than fight in the streets. And it's probably better that you have one massive honeypot where all kinds of bad and good things happen than a bunch of distributed honeypots, which is the technical equivalent of whack-a-mole. Like, there's nobody here, if you're in an election cycle, you'd be hard-pressed to suggest a number 2 company after Facebook. So my point is, we all know where the bodies are buried. So in that way, it's really good. And they do a lot of good. So that's good. My perspective on Facebook is the reason why the market gives it a small multiple is because they don't believe their earning potential is durable. And the reason they don't believe it is because they are pretty sure that in the next handful of years, not 25 years, but in the next 10 or so years, governments start to act because they care about their own self-preservation.
Right.
If you get very reductionist on it, at the end of the day, that's what they care about. And so they're going to legislate to protect their monopoly which is the ability to have power.
I mean, if I owned equal parts of Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook, am I really worse off than if I own just one monolithic Facebook? As a shareholder, should I really care?
Well, as a shareholder, you're trying to buy the longest term of,
Right, so I might argue that those companies
earnings
would each perform better if they were separate, not worse.
I have no idea whether they would perform better, the same, or worse. Governments will break them up not because of a business perspective and not because of shareholder value. They will insert themselves into the running of that company and eventually into the running of Google because it gets in the way of their own monopoly. It introduces a level of competition that they don't want to see in their own home market. So this is what I'm saying, where I don't have a real moral or ethical perspective on whether you should work, if you're Cheryl, whether you should work there or not. I think shareholders should have a moral and ethical perspective on whether they want to own it. Employees clearly underwrite that by going to the office every day. I'm just saying very objectively, they have, whether they like to or not, stepped into a dynamic where other governments can now compete off their home turf through this one company. And so if you're a monopoly, which the US government is in the United States, you're not going to want other countries competing with you. If you're a monopoly in France, the French don't want other competitors, other governmental actors in their home market. They're willing to tolerate it under the radar, which is what espionage and all this other stuff has always been meant to be, but not where you can go to a portal and buy ads with a credit card.
Kara was just on stage. She was ranting, appropriately so, about Masa, excess capital, weapons of economic destruction. I did hear her say that she compared Uber to WeWork and said it's just not economically feasible. That Uber's not economically feasible. Do you think Uber's WeWork, and do you think it's not economically feasible?
No. I think WeWork is basically a fabulous tale about the excesses of this last cycle of capitalism gone amok. And we can talk about that forever. Uber is a very different business. I think really the big debate on Uber is not whether it will be profitable, because I think in the next short number of years it will be. It is whether it's basically an airline or not. And what I mean by that is, is it an elastic good? And will people look for Spirit Airlines versus United versus Southwest? I suspect that they will. And can they provide that equivalent amount of choice in a way where you can make a lot of money? I don't think so. Because the minute that there's excess returns in that market, much like the airlines for the last 50 or 60 years, people will jump in. And unlike airlines, which are expensive, and you still need to be well capitalized to enter as a competitor, Uber, you really don't. And so excess profit dollars are not there for the having. And so, you'll be a duopoly market in America, but I think it's roughly a consumer surplus. I think it's a valuable product, but I think it's high volume, low margin, and it's a low multiple business.
We'll revisit
WeWork, WeWork, I think, is just kind of like you're just waiting for the other shoe to fall, which is the lease obligations and a complete implosion.
For what it's worth, Uber will come back. I think it's a high margin business. I think the rides business will do 25, 30% EBITDA margins. I'm also an investor in the airlines. I don't think it's anything like the airlines. They don't own assets. They don't have to replace depreciating planes. You have 2 players, not 10 players. But I do think that when we talk about excess capital leading to weapons of economic destruction, what we saw during this period was Masa was spraying and praying, but rather than an angel investor, he was spraying and praying with $500 million checks. The venture capitalists from Ola to Didi to Lyft, etc., DoorDash, Postmates, Swiggy, Rappi, go around the globe, Meituan, were effectively just engaged in diseconomic activity to drive the top line. That's being wrung out of the system.
Yeah.
And the reason that Uber's EBITDA margins have gone from 8% in rides to 21% to 24% over the last 3 quarters is there's no more excess capital chasing the global rideshare market. That would be an alternative hypothesis.
What I'll say is, I think you're probably one of the 3 best next generation tech investors in Silicon Valley. And
that'll get you everywhere.
If I were not investing directly myself, I would come to you and try to beg you to take my money. That's how good I think you are.
Thank you.
You bought the airlines 3 years ago after 50 years of people got their brains bashed in. And so all I was trying to paint the case is, the Uber business or Lyft business, ride sharing in general, I think looks like the airlines in its early days, not the airlines where they are today. And I do agree with you at some point, there will be a case to be made for owning these businesses. I just don't think it's now or for the near foreseeable future. That's it. Now, on to Masa. It is an enormous tell about the state of the world economy that what's happened. Now, at the end of the day, it's not really Masa's fault because LPs needed to give him $100 billion. And even if it was half of it was his as SoftBank's money, that money was raised via debt, which means that somewhere around the world there's a pension fund or an institution that owns an obligation that is basically betting on all of this. And that has traces and sources and roots that are much more independent than Masa. We started this whole charade a decade ago. We thought that the only way for everybody to basically be saved from this massive peril of the financial crisis was to bail out a few people who created it. We took rates to 0 and then to below 0 in the hopes that capitalists like myself and yourself would put money into productive assets, hire people, pay them more. And we didn't. We went to a fucking Sotheby's auction. We started to buy art. We bought planes. We bought yachts. We bought all this nonsense, all these unproductive assets, and the money didn't trickle down. And so in this hyperloop of people just saying, oh my gosh, where are the returns? Where are the returns? Where are the returns? Masa was created. So he didn't go out to do something nefarious. He's the symbolism of, again, a period in time of excess. And so what we have to do is move the pendulum back. We have to delever. These wealth taxes are not such a bad thing. They suck for rich people, but they're generally productive. Capitalism will not stop. People will continue to start companies. All of that stuff is just complete propaganda. It's not true. Like, look at the data. When income tax rates were 94% in America, you had the same GDP as when they are today. Okay? In the last 100 years, income tax has gone like this, GDP has done this. They're not correlated. They have never been correlated. Human ingenuity and human spirit exists because we want meaning and understanding. We don't start companies or stop companies because the effective marginal tax rate went up 200 basis points. That's not how people...
I have heard some people think that Masa was a CIA plot to destroy Saudi wealth.
No.
No, you don't think so?
No. I think the Saudis literally...
Would you agree with Kara said earlier, the Saudis are murderous thugs? Do you agree with that?
Are they murderous thugs?
For the killing of Khashoggi.
Yeah, I think that was pretty reprehensible.
Brad?
I mean, you can't...
You have a question?
No.
I mean, we're just getting into it. I mean, is it okay with the people backstage? Glenn said we could go an extra 20 minutes. You good with that? Okay, good. Go ahead.
Great conversation, and it's really refreshing to have these sorts of topics addressed. I'm just wondering about hyper-capitalism and the dysfunction you're talking about. Are we realistically going to see reform from government and regulation from government with the hyper-partisanship that's obviously evident here in the United States, and seemingly little or nothing can get done?
I think you're seeing what's going to happen, which is we first have the rise of populism. And, populist figures can be shocking. But they're a natural first step in fixing the system. Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, the head of Brazil, all these people, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, they're all the same. And I know that can offend people, but they actually are all the same. They're all basically there because they sit on top of a pulpit of power given to them by broad swaths of people who are completely and utterly frustrated and disenfranchised. Because in the last 10 years, this sense of building inequity has been exacerbated. But then what happens is you pick your poison. And what I mean by that is, look at what happened in Virginia. Virginia went completely Democratic. From the governor, state senate, legislature. They will do whatever they think is right. There will be other states that have been completely Republican for years. There are others that are a mixture. And you'll have basically laws that effectively reflect that. I mean, what's interesting is that, the United States, we didn't know this until social media, but truly the United States are 50 different little countries, kind of all patchwork together. Like, people in California probably hated people in Mississippi forever. It's just now on Twitter, you're forced to interact and you realize, why you hate each other so much. So but you just didn't have to deal with it before. Now you have to deal with it. And so I think what happens is you have these populist figures that catalyze the fact that change is important. The pendulum swings back and forth because you don't know which one to pick. Populist right, populist left. We will probably have a change in government at the federal level. It probably will be a populist left candidate. They will probably get one piece of legislation passed, which has been the norm since Obama. You get one thing done, and in the next 4 to 8 years, you just kind of sit around twiddling your thumbs pretending. And eventually, you will have a candidate that organizes a better perspective worldview that gets Democrats and Republicans to vote a moderated form of action because it's in their political best interest. We haven't found that candidate yet. We don't have that yet on either side. And so we're going to go through this violent back and forth until we find that person. That'll take another probably 2 election cycles. But it will get changed. Legislation will be the way that it happens. Taxes for the rich are going up. Regulation for the tech companies is coming. There will be the opportunity to define ambitious goals for the human race and decide to work towards it. And the question is now, will we have the resolve, and will it happen before the frustration erupts in violence? And what you see in Hong Kong is that they couldn't get the equation balanced fast enough. And that should really be a canary in a coal mine for something that's much more important, which is, wow, we have a short fuse on this. We have a 5 to 10 year window to fix this. Because that's been simmering for 40 years.
I think I agree. I think it's an important conversation. I wish we could go a lot longer. I'm going to do a quick lightning round. Just long or short. You either are betting on it or betting against it.
Say the valuation if you're going to say a company.
Yes. Hypersonic air travel that turns a 10-hour flight into a 1-hour flight in the next 10 years.
Long.
Virgin Galactic.
Yeah.
Facebook.
At this price?
At this price.
Short.
Uber at this price.
Neither long nor short.
Masa's Vision Fund.
Short.
Wealth tax.
Long.
WeWork going bankrupt.
Long.
San Francisco.
Short.
Fixing our climate problem.
Long. Massively long.
Artificial intelligence impacting our lives in noticeable ways in the next 5 years.
Short.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Chamath. Appreciate you giving us your time. Thanks, brother.
Thanks, brother.
Between the artful chopping, flavorful spices, and alluring aromas lies the ingredients to life stories. Whether it's to remote villages or concrete jungles. I travel because when I eat with strangers, we share more than a meal.
Early on, he wanted to be a writer, but luckily for his career and his current company, he is about to finish his third year